And let's begin in Hong Kong, where now familiar scenes of violence have taken place after tens of thousands of protesters defied a police ban and marched through the city this afternoon. Now, the unsanctioned rally began in Causeway Bay. It started out peacefully, but small groups of hardcore protesters began vandalizing the Admiralty MTR station. Some were seen vandalizing security cameras and spray painting over the name of the station. And that's when police fired several rounds of tear gas and water cannon to disperse the crowds, who later responded by hurling rocks and throwing petrol bombs at the government headquarters. Earlier in the day, protesters marched from Edinburgh Place to the British consulate, calling on the UK to do more to protect its former colony. Now, they also want London to ramp up pressure on Beijing. Let's cross now to Afifah Ariffin. She's standing by in Causeway Bay with the latest on the situation. Afifah, since the water cannon and the tear gas came out, the crowds have really dispersed to multiple locations.
That's right, indeed. There are no protesters anywhere in sight here where I'm at in Causeway Bay. We're actually following the riot police who have done their clearance operation all the way from Admiralty to Causeway Bay where we're at. That's about 5 to 6 kilometers away. Earlier in the evening, there was a very intense standoff between the police and the protesters who had gathered outside of the central government offices. Now, tens of thousands of protesters had marched on the streets from Causeway Bay earlier today at about 2 p.m. To Central, where they gathered outside there. Despite, multiple rounds of tear gas being fired by the police, the protesters were still defiant. They still did not disperse. That had prompted the police to bring out the water cannon trucks. And the water cannon trucks are being deployed for the third time. It was first deployed for the first time on 25th August and for the second time just 2 weeks ago. It was also the second time that the police had used blue ink in the water jets. It was only when the water cannons and dozens of riot police went onto the roads outside of Admiralty. That was when protesters started to disperse in various directions, and we were unable to track exactly where the protesters had go. But we do know that they had moved eastward, and they had in Wan Chai, that was their last district that they had hit, where they set up barricades all along the road, along Hennessy Road, and they had also started a fire outside the MTR station, prompting the MTR authorities to close down Wan Chai and Admiralty Station. But right now, here in Causeway Bay, we are really just seeing the police doing their clearance operation. There are hundreds of police that have marched here. Many of them have also fanned out in various directions, trying to track the protesters who are at this point in time nowhere in sight.
Yeah, we had a very good shot of that water cannon with the blue dye being fired. Of course, that's to identify the protesters later on in the process. But it is the 15th weekend that they've come out. Have the protesters' strategy changed in any way that you've noticed?
That's right. It's been a couple of months now, and so the strategies or the tactics that have been adopted by the protesters have, of course, evolved. Now, we have seen that the protests here in Hong Kong first started out as peaceful marches, and they later became violent. One of the more prominent tactics that we saw protesters use in the first couple of months here in... Apologies, we got to walk as the riot police are clearing us out. But as I was saying, the protesters adopted a sort of flash mob strategy, a sort of hit-and-run tactic where they played a cat-and-mouse game with the police, where they would hit one district, cause a bit of chaos and commotion there, and then move to another area. They were, of course, aided by the MTRs, and it was very easy for them to move around. But shortly, about just a month ago, the MTR stations started to close down, especially in areas where protests were taking place. Now, this had very much angered the protesters, who then turned on the MTR corporation, and they had also began to vandalize and destroy the MTR properties, including some of the turnstiles. They broke the barricades or the shutters of the MTR station, and the glass windows of the MTR station and the trains as well. And later on, we're also seeing protesters become a lot more defiant. So, for example, in that intense standoff today between the protesters and the police at the central government offices, when police fired multiple multiple rounds of tear gas. Protesters did not disperse. Even when they used the water cannons from inside of the office, central government headquarters, the protesters still did not move. In fact, all they did was that they banded together and used their umbrella as shields, and they then, took when the police threw tear gas, all they did was to throw the tear gas back into the building, and they also threw bricks and petrol bombs as well. So we have seen how the protesters are, changing their tactics. There's a lot more of a concerted efforts. In fact, many residents are also helping the protesters. We're hearing that protesters, once they disperse, they would actually change out of their typical attire, the black shirt and the protective gear, and they'll wear normal civilian clothes, so they're quite unidentifiable by the police as well. Of course, the police are also, becoming more accustomed to some of these tactics that the protesters have used, and they will put a lot more officers on standby at various locations in different areas where they anticipate that protests could break out.